rip of fabric was a vulgar sound in a place dedicated to subtlety. It sliced through the string quartet's rendition of a Vivaldi concerto, sharp and ugly, a sound that didn't belong amidst the clinking of crystal and hushed important conversations. Every head in the Michelin-starred dining room of The Gilded Lyre turned. Tiffany LaSalle stood with her chest heaving, a triumphant, venomous smirk twisting her surgically perfected lips. In her hand, she clutched a swatch of simple navy blue fabric. Before her, a waitress frozen in place, now had the shoulder and sleeve of her modest uniform torn open, revealing the pale, vulnerable skin beneath. "Maybe that will teach you to watch where you're going, trash," Tiffany hissed, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. "This is a Chanel suit. You probably make less in a year than this jacket costs." The waitress didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't even flush with shame. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of hazel, simply met Tiffany's with a composure so profound it was unnerving. In that gaze there was no fear, only a quiet, assessing fire. The patrons murmured, a ripple of discomfort and morbid curiosity spreading through the room. They saw a powerful socialite humiliating a lowly server. What they didn't see was that the waitress was Eleanor Vance, and they had no idea that the city's most formidable and reclusive billionaire, a man who hadn't been seen at a public restaurant in nearly 5 years, was about to break his self-imposed exile. The Gilded Lyre was less a restaurant and more a temple to exorbitant taste. Tucked away on a quiet, cobblestone street in the most exclusive part of Boston, it was a place where deals that shaped the global economy were signed over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of Chateau Margaux. The lighting was an art form, golden and forgiving, making every patron look like a subject in a Rembrandt painting. The air was thick with the scent of money, old and new, mingling with the aroma of white truffles and expensive perfume. To the clientele, the titans of industry, the political power brokers, the inheritors of dynastic fortunes, the staff were meant to be ghosts. They moved with silent efficiency, anticipating needs before they were voiced, their faces trained into masks of pleasant neutrality. Tonight, Eleanor Vance, known to her colleagues and the patrons simply as Ellie, was one of these ghosts. Her uniform was a simple but well-tailored navy blue dress, its clean lines a stark contrast to the couture armor worn by the women she served. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back into a severe, practical knot at the nape of her neck. To the casual observer, she was utterly unremarkable. Just another young woman working a difficult job to make ends meet. And that was precisely the illusion she cultivated. From her position near the service station, she had an unobstructed view of the entire room. Her eyes, trained for decades on things far smaller and more intricate than human beings, missed nothing. She saw the nervous tick in the jaw of a CEO trying to secure a merger, the subtle, desperate glance a young wife gave her older, wealthier husband, the way a handshake lingered just a second too long, signaling a deal had been struck. This world, with its unspoken rules and brutal hierarchies, was a complex mechanism, and Eleanor understood mechanisms better than anyone. Her attention kept returning to Table 7, the most coveted booth in the restaurant. There sat Chad Thorne, the latest wonderkin of the tech world. His company, InnovateX, had recently gone public, making him a paper billionaire overnight. He had the kind of blow-dried, overconfident handsomeness that graced the covers of business magazines, but his eyes were restless, constantly scanning the room for validation. Clinging to his arm like a diamond-encrusted limpet was Tiffany LaSalle. Tiffany was the daughter of a real estate magnate, a woman who had been born on third base and was convinced she'd hit a triple. Her beauty was undeniable but harsh, all sharp angles and calculated pouts. Her dress was a shimmering, garish gold number that screamed its price tag. She laughed too loudly, gestured too broadly, her every movement a desperate performance of her own importance. Eleanor had been observing them for an hour, not out of personal interest, but professional necessity. The manager had warned the staff that Chad Thorne was entertaining a potential investor tonight, a notoriously private Japanese industrialist named Mr. Sato. The service had to be flawless. Eleanor's grandfather, a man who had survived the old country with nothing but his skills, had taught her two things: the profound dignity of skilled labor and the art of observation. "Look at a man's hands and his watch, Ellie girl," he used to say, his voice thick with a European accent. "They will tell you more than his mouth ever will." He had been a master horologist, a watchmaker of sublime genius, and he had passed his gift, his entire world of gears and springs and escapements, down to her. She had inherited his steady hands, his jeweler's loop, and his passion. Her dream wasn't to serve men like Chad Thorne, but to have her own small workshop, a quiet sanctuary where she could bring beautiful, broken timepieces back to life. This job, with its generous tips from guilt-ridden millionaires, was the final stepping stone to funding that dream. "Waitress!" Tiffany snapped her fingers, a sharp, imperious sound that made Eleanor's jaw tighten. "More sparkling water. Now! And tell the bartender to put a lime in it this time." "Is that so difficult to remember?" Eleanor maintained her professional calm. "Of course, ma'am. My apologies." Her voice was soft even, betraying none of the irritation she felt. As she leaned in to retrieve the empty water bottle, Tiffany's gaze fell upon her, cold and dismissive. It was the look one gives to a piece of furniture that is slightly out of place. But then, a flicker of something else crossed Tiffany's face, a primal, competitive assessment. Eleanor was not beautiful in the same manufactured way as Tiffany. Her features were softer, her beauty quieter, radiating an innate self-possession that no uniform could fully conceal. She possessed a stillness in a room full of performative noise, and Tiffany, whose entire identity was built on being the center of attention, found it deeply offensive. "Are you even listening to me?" Tiffany demanded. "Yes, ma'am. Sparkling water with a lime?" Eleanor confirmed, retreating from the table with practiced grace. Chad, ever the insecure peacock, gave Eleanor a slick, dismissive smile. "Don't mind her," he said, loud enough for his guest, Mr. Sato, to hear. "She just has very high standards." He was trying to frame Tiffany's rudeness as a charming quirk of the elite. Mr. Sato, an older, impeccably dressed man with an aura of immense calm, simply took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes unreadable. He hadn't said more than 10 words all evening, and his silence seemed to make Chad increasingly nervous. Eleanor returned with the water, her movements fluid and silent. She placed it on the table, ensuring the label faced away from the guests, a small detail of fine service. Tiffany ignored her, now engrossed in showing Mr. Sato a photo on her phone, likely of her latest shopping spree. Eleanor began to move away, her part in the little drama seemingly over. She had a moment of quiet satisfaction. Another 2 months of this, another few $1,000s saved, and she could finally leave this world behind. She could trade the forced smiles and quiet indignities for the satisfying click of a perfectly set jewel pivot. Her path back to the service station was suddenly blocked. Tiffany LaSalle stood before her face a mask of petulance. "Excuse me, ma'am," Eleanor said, attempting to sidestep her. "I saw you," Tiffany said, her voice low and accusatory. "You've been staring at my fiancé all night." The accusation was so patently absurd it almost made Eleanor laugh. She had been observing the table, yes, but her focus had been on the quiet investor, Mr. Sato, and the magnificent timepiece on his wrist, a vintage Grand Seiko, a masterpiece of Japanese craftsmanship. She'd been admiring its clean lines and the flawless sweep of its second hand. Chad Thorne and his desperate posturing barely registered. "I assure you, ma'am, I was only monitoring the table to ensure you had everything you needed," Eleanor replied, her voice still a model of professional decorum. "Don't lie to me," Tiffany sneered, taking a step closer, invading Eleanor's personal space. The cloying scent of her perfume was overwhelming. "I know your type. Little nobodies who think they can flirt their way into a better life. You see a man like Chad, a man with drive and vision, and you think you can bat your eyelashes and get his attention. Let me make something crystal clear for you. He is mine. A little gutter rat in a cheap uniform wouldn't even be a momentary distraction." The confrontation was drawing attention. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. Chad, seeing the storm brewing, began to rise, a look of weary exasperation on his face. He knew Tiffany's volcanic temper all too well. Mr. Sato watched the exchange with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects. "Tiffany, come on," Chad said, his voice a strained whisper. "You're making a scene. Let it go." She started it, Tiffany snapped, yanking her arm away from his placating touch. Her eyes, glittering with a wild, irrational fury, locked back onto Eleanor. She needed to assert her dominance, to put this quiet, composed waitress back in her place. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Standing there, judging me with your sad little eyes. Before Eleanor could form a reply, before Chad could properly intervene, Tiffany's hand shot out. It wasn't a slap. It was something far more calculated, far more demeaning. Her fingers, tipped with long, blood-red nails, hooked into the neckline of Eleanor's uniform. The fabric was sturdy, but Tiffany's rage was stronger. With a vicious, downward tug, she ripped it open. The sound was shockingly loud, a tearing, grating noise that made several patrons physically flinch. For a heartbeat, the entire restaurant was suspended in stunned silence. The torn navy fabric gaped, exposing Eleanor's collarbone and the soft curve of her shoulder in a jagged, ugly line. It was an act of pure, symbolic violence, a public branding. I am powerful, and you are nothing. I can tear you apart, and you are helpless to stop me. Tiffany stepped back, her chest rising and falling dramatically, the ugly, triumphant smirk returning to her face. She held up the torn scrap of fabric as if it were a trophy. There, she declared, her voice ringing with satisfaction. Now your outside matches your inside. Cheap and torn. A collective gasp finally rippled through the room. This was not the discreet drama they were used to. This was brutish, a crude display of power that violated the unspoken codes of their class. Chad's face went from annoyed to ashen. This wasn't just a scene, it was a disaster. His potential investor was witnessing this grotesque spectacle. He grabbed Tiffany's arm, his grip hard and angry. "What in God's name is wrong with you?" he hissed. But Eleanor wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the shocked faces of the diners or the horrified expressions of her fellow staff members, who were frozen, terrified of being drawn into the vortex. Her hazel eyes were fixed on Tiffany. There was no fear, no shame, no tears. There was only that profound, chilling calm, the placid surface of a deep, cold lake. This unnerving composure seemed to enrage Tiffany more than any emotional outburst would have. She had wanted to see Eleanor crumble, to produce tears as proof of her victory. The waitress's stoicism was an infuriating act of defiance. "What's the matter?" Tiffany taunted, her voice rising in pitch. "Cat got your tongue? Go on, run to your manager and cry. I'll have you fired before you can even blink. I'll make sure you never serve another glass of water in this city again." Eleanor finally moved. With a slow, deliberate grace, she reached up and gently took the shredded piece of fabric from Tiffany's fingers. Tiffany, startled by the unexpected action, let it go. Eleanor looked down at the scrap in her hand. She folded it once, neatly, her movements precise and unhurried. Then she tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Finally, she looked back at Tiffany, and when she spoke, her voice was different. The soft, subservient tone was gone, replaced by something clear, measured and resonant with an authority that was utterly alien to her uniform. "You have made a very serious mistake," Eleanor said. The shift was so abrupt, it was like a change in atmospheric pressure. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the serene certainty of a mathematician presenting a proven theorem. Chad felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He looked at the waitress, really looked at her, for the first time. The uniform was a costume. Beneath it, there was something else, something solid and formidable. His instincts, honed in cutthroat negotiations, were screaming at him that Tiffany had just blundered into a minefield. "A mistake?" Tiffany laughed, a shrill, brittle sound. "Are you threatening me? This is hilarious. Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Eleanor replied, her voice still level. "You are Tiffany LaSalle. Your father is a commercial real estate developer. You have an art history degree from a college you never attended and a reputation for mistaking cruelty for strength. Your entire identity is built on the things you own, not the things you are." The clinical, detailed recitation stunned Tiffany into a momentary silence. The crowd murmured, their interest now fully ignited. This was no longer a simple case of bullying. This was something else entirely. How do you know that?" Tiffany stammered, her bravado faltering. But the real drama was just beginning. Chad, desperate to salvage the evening with his investor, decided to double down on his bravado. He stepped forward, putting a possessive arm around Tiffany. "All right, that's enough," he said, trying to project an authority he didn't feel. He turned to Mr. Sato. "My apologies, Sato-san. A minor domestic issue. This waitress has been completely unprofessional." He then turned back to Eleanor. "You're fired. Get out." But Eleanor's focus was now on Chad. Her eyes drifted down from his face to his wrist. Throughout the evening, he had been ostentatiously flashing his watch, a rare vintage Patek Philippe, a symbol of old money and sophisticated taste that he wore like a rented costume. "You want to talk about professionalism, Mr. Thorne?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but caring. "Let's talk about that watch." Chad blinked, thrown off balance. "My watch? What about it?" "It's a reference 2499, Eleanor stated calmly. "Third series, an exceptionally rare and beautiful piece. It's also a fake." The silence in the room was now absolute. Every person there understood the gravity of that accusation. To be accused of wearing a counterfeit Patek Philippe in a place like the Gilded Lyre was a social death sentence. Chad's face turned a mottled shade of red. "How dare you? This watch was authenticated. It cost more than your life." "The lugs are too thick by 0.5 millimeter," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a lecturer's precision. "The signature on the dial is slightly too centered, a common mistake in high-end forgeries from the Shenzhen region. And if you were to listen to the movement, you'd hear a beat rate of 21,600 vibrations per hour. The original caliber 13 CH has a rate of 18,000. It's a masterful fake, I'll grant you. But it's as fake as your fiancé's surprise at being called out for her behavior." Tiffany, seeing her champion being dismantled, flew into another rage. "You lying little bitch!" she shrieked and lunged forward, not at Eleanor, but at Chad. "You told me it was real. You bought me a fake Birkin last year, didn't you? Is anything about you real?" In her fury, she swiped at his arm. Her hand connected with his wrist, knocking the watch from its strap. It flew through the air in a glittering arc, landing with a sickening, metallic crack on the hard marble floor. A collective groan went through the room. Real or fake, the destruction of such an object was a sacrilege. Chad Thorne stared at the fallen timepiece, his face a mask of pure horror. His entire persona, the carefully constructed image of a tech mogul with old-world taste, lay shattered on the floor beside the watch. Mr. Sato, the investor, slowly placed his napkin on the table. He looked at Chad not with anger, but with a quiet, profound disappointment that was infinitely worse. The deal was dead. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply watched the chaos she had unleashed with her quiet truth. She had disarmed them not with threats or violence, but with knowledge. Her grandfather had been right. A man's watch told you everything. Chad Thorne's told the world he was a fraud. It was into this tableau of ruined ambitions that a new figure entered. The restaurant's heavy oak doors opened, and the manager, a man famous for his unflappable demeanor, practically sprinted into the room, his face pale with panic. He was followed by a man who moved with an unhurried grace that was more commanding than any strut. He was tall and lean, dressed not in a flashy suit, but in a perfectly tailored dark gray cashmere sweater, charcoal trousers, and simple leather shoes. He had sharp, intelligent features, silvering hair at the temples, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wasn't a man who needed to shout to command a room. His very presence was a gravitational force, pulling all attention towards him. Power radiated from him, not the loud, desperate power of Chad Thorne, but the deep, silent power of bedrock. The murmurs in the room changed. It was no longer about the fight, it was about him. "Is that? It can't be. Alistair Finch, the legendary recluse, head of Finch Consolidated, a private global empire with holdings in everything from shipping to rare earth minerals. A man who had inherited a significant fortune and quietly multiplied it 100-fold. A man who hadn't been photographed in a decade and whose name was only ever spoken in whispers in the highest echelons of finance. And he was walking directly towards the disaster at Table 7. He ignored Chad and Tiffany completely. His gaze, piercing and intense, was fixed solely on Eleanor. He took in her torn uniform, her exposed shoulder, and her unshakable calm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, relief, frustration, and a deep, abiding affection, passed through her eyes. Alistair stopped in front of her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he spoke, his words were quiet, but they cut through the tension like a diamond blade through glass. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low baritone that was both gentle and laced with cold fury. "I believe you are finished with your shift." The use of her full name, spoken with such familiar authority, was a thunderclap in the silent room. Chad Thorne's jaw dropped. He looked from the mythical Alistair Finch to the waitress he had just fired, and a dawning, sickening horror began to creep into his consciousness. Alistair Finch, the shadow of Wall Street, had just entered the game, and he looked like he was ready to burn the entire board. Alistair Finch's presence fundamentally altered the reality of the room. The air, which had been crackling with the cheap drama of Tiffany's tantrum, was now thick with a palpable sense of dread. He was a leviathan that had surfaced in a koi pond, and the other fish were suddenly acutely aware of their own insignificance. He didn't acknowledge the gawking patrons or the terrified manager who was hovering nearby, wringing his hands. His focus was a laser beam, first on Eleanor, then sweeping over the human wreckage of Table 7. His gaze lingered for a moment on Tiffany, who had shrunk back against the banquette, her face pale beneath its expensive foundation. For the first time in her life, she understood what it was to be truly powerless. His eyes then moved to Chad, and the look he gave the younger man was one of pure surgical contempt. It was a look that didn't just dismiss, it erased. Chad swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Mr. Finch," he managed to choke out, his voice a reedy thing. I didn't know. We had no idea." "That is precisely the problem, isn't it?" Alistair replied, his voice still deceptively calm. "You act without knowing. You speak without thinking. You build an image on a foundation of lies." His gaze flicked down to the shattered watch on the floor. "And you lack the expertise to even choose your forgeries wisely." Each word was a perfectly placed blow, dismantling what little was left of Chad's composure. The public humiliation was absolute. Alistair turned his attention back to Eleanor. With a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with the menace he projected, he reached out and lightly touched her arm, his fingers tracing the ripped edge of her uniform. "Did she hurt you?" he asked, his voice low, for her ears only. "I'm fine, Alistair," Eleanor murmured, a hint of exasperation in her tone. "You shouldn't be here. You know how you feel about this." She gestured vaguely at the room full of staring faces. "I know," he said, his thumb stroking her arm, "but I also know that I was waiting in the car for you, and you were 20 minutes late, and I had a feeling." He had been a widower for 10 years, a loss that had hollowed him out and turned him into a recluse. Eleanor was the first person who had managed to breach his walls, not with sympathy, but with her quiet competence and her shared appreciation for a world that ran on precision and integrity. She had grounded him, and the thought of anyone laying a hand on her had stirred a protective instinct so fierce it had momentarily overridden his deep-seated aversion to public life. He shrugged off his tailored blazer. It was a simple dark navy Loro Piana, a garment of such understated quality that it made Chad's flashy suit look like a costume. He draped it gently over Eleanor's shoulders, covering the torn uniform and her exposed skin. The jacket was far too large for her, but the gesture was so possessive, so unapologetically tender, that it sent a fresh wave of speculation rippling through the ballroom. Who was she to him? A secret daughter? A protege? The whispers were frantic. "Mr. Dubois," Alistair said, addressing the restaurant manager without looking at him. The manager scurried forward. "Yes, Mr. Finch." "Sir? Is there anything—" "There is," Alistair said coolly. "My fiancée, Miss Vance, has been assaulted by one of your patrons. Her uniform has been destroyed. I trust you have security footage of the incident." "Fiancée," The word dropped into the silent room with the force of a physical impact. It was a bomb that vaporized every other theory. It reconfigured the entire evening, the entire power dynamic. The quiet waitress wasn't just a person under Alistair Finch's protection. She was to be his wife, the future Mrs. Alistair Finch. A woman who would soon command an empire that could buy and sell everyone in this room 1,000 times over. Chad Thorne looked as though he had been physically struck. He staggered back a step, his face a ghastly white. He hadn't just fired a waitress. He had ordered the fiancée of Alistair Finch out of the room. He hadn't just allowed his girlfriend to bully a server. He had stood by while she assaulted the future queen of a financial dynasty. Tiffany LaSalle made a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. The full, horrifying scope of her miscalculation crashed down on her. She had built her entire identity on a hierarchy of wealth and status, and she had just committed the ultimate sin. She had attacked someone who was, in the only currency that mattered to her, infinitely superior. Eleanor gave Alistair a look that was equal parts gratitude and admonishment. Their engagement was a new private thing, something they were still savoring away from the world's glare. This was not how she had wanted it to be revealed, but she also understood the strategic necessity of it. Alistair was ending the confrontation with a single, undeniable declaration of fact. "As for your guests," Alistair continued, his eyes slicing back to Chad and Tiffany, "send them their bill, and then inform them that they are no longer welcome in any establishment that wishes to maintain a cordial relationship with Finch Consolidated, which is, I believe, all of them." It was a corporate execution delivered with the detached air of a man ordering coffee. He was not just throwing them out of a restaurant, he was exiling them from their entire world. Every exclusive club, every charity gala, every private resort, all doors would now be closed to them. "And Mr. Thorne," Alistair added, a final chilling thought occurring to him, "your company, InnovateX, I believe my venture capital division was considering a second round of funding. Consider that offer permanently rescinded. I will also be advising my associates to divest themselves of your stock at market open tomorrow. I imagine it will be a rather volatile day for you." This was the killing blow. He wasn't just ruining their night, he was methodically dismantling Chad's entire career. The company built on hype and borrowed credibility was about to have its foundations vaporized. Chad could only stare, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was a man watching his own ghost fall from a skyscraper. Alistair turned his back on them then, a gesture of final, absolute dismissal. He offered his arm to Eleanor. "Shall we go home, my love?" he asked, his voice softening completely. Eleanor slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, pulling his jacket tighter around her shoulders. It smelled of him, a clean, familiar scent of cedar and old books. It smelled like safety. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let's." Together they turned and walked towards the door. The patrons parted for them as if they were royalty, a sea of awed, terrified faces. They moved from the center of the chaos into the quiet of the night, leaving a crater of social and financial ruin in their wake. Just as they reached the exit, Eleanor paused. She turned back one last time, her gaze sweeping over the room. She looked at Tiffany, now weeping hysterically into her hands, and at Chad, who stood paralyzed, a man already erased. Her eyes finally settled on the fallen watch, the expensive fake lying broken on the floor. It was a perfect metaphor for the two people who had tried to humiliate her, all glittering surface with nothing true or lasting inside. Then she turned and walked out the door with the man she loved, leaving the wreckage behind for others to clean up. She was no longer Eleanor the waitress. She was Eleanor Vance, the horologist. And she was, as the entire city would learn by morning, the future Mrs. Finch. The quiet ghost had become a queen, and her reign was just beginning. The silence in the Bentley on the way back to Alistair's Beacon Hill townhouse was a comfortable, shared space. The city lights slid across the windows, painting fleeting patterns on Eleanor's face. She leaned her head against the cool leather of the seat, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving a deep-seated exhaustion in its place. Alistair's blazer was still draped over her shoulders, a cocoon of warmth and security. He drove himself, eschewing the chauffeur he kept on staff. He valued his privacy, and after the night's events, he craved it more than ever. His hands rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was calm on the surface, but Eleanor knew him. Beneath the stoic exterior, a cold, controlled fury was still simmering. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "That's not how I wanted anyone to find out about us." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "There is nothing for you to be sorry for," he said, his voice firm. "You were magnificent. You took a situation designed to humiliate you and turned it into a masterclass on grace and expertise. You didn't need me to save you, Eleanor. You'd already won." "My methods are quieter than yours," she allowed, a small smile touching her lips. The silence inside the Bentley was a physical presence, a dense, weighted thing that absorbed the fleeting city lights and the muted hum of the engine. It was not the comfortable silence they often shared, the quiet understanding of two people content in each other's presence. This was the stillness of a compressed spring, a reservoir of immense potential energy. Alistair's hands were steady on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, but Eleanor could see the fine, taut line of his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders beneath the fine cashmere. He was a storm contained, a force of nature deliberately holding itself in check. His blazer, draped over her, was a cocoon of impossible softness and warmth, carrying his scent, a subtle, clean fragrance of cedar, old paper, and something uniquely him. Something that had always meant safety. But tonight it felt less like a comfort and more like a mantle of responsibility. She was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the horologist hiding in plain sight. She was the woman for whom Alistair Finch had broken his 5-year exile. The gravity of that fact was beginning to settle in her bones, heavier than any fatigue. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice softer than she intended, a ghost in the opulent quiet. "Announcing it. Us. Not like that." He turned his head for a fraction of a second, his winter sky eyes meeting hers. The fury in them was so cold it was incandescent. "Yes, I did," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the car. "They needed to understand the scale of their transgression. They didn't assault a waitress, Eleanor. They assaulted the future matriarch of my house. The distinction is everything." "I'm still the same person I was an hour ago," she argued gently, though she knew it was futile. The world had shifted on its axis. "The one who was perfectly capable of handling them myself." "I know," he conceded, his grip on the wheel tightening. "I saw you. You disarmed them with nothing but your expertise and your composure. It was magnificent. You took their cheap, brutish power and exposed it for the counterfeit it was. You had already won the battle." He paused, navigating a turn onto a quiet, gaslit street in Beacon Hill. "But I am going to win the war. What you did was an act of precision, a masterful defense. What comes next is an act of demolition. It is what I do." "Alistair," she pleaded softly, placing her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath was like granite. "They're not worth the energy. They're just empty, insignificant." "No," he countered, the word as sharp and final as a slammed vault door. "They are not. They are a symptom of a sickness, the kind of casual cruelty that festers in the absence of consequences." Thorne stood by, a silent accomplice, valuing a potential investment over your dignity. LaSalle tore at you to feel powerful, to reinforce a social hierarchy built on nothing but currency. They are not insignificant. They are a systemic risk, and systemic risk must be eliminated. She leaned back, understanding the argument was over. She had seen this side of him before, though never directed with such personal vehemence. He viewed the world of finance and power as a grand, intricate mechanism, a vast clockwork universe, and people like Chad and Tiffany were debris in the gears, causing friction and threatening the integrity of the entire machine. He was not acting out of simple anger. He was acting out of a profound, unshakable belief in order. He was about to regulate his world, and the process would be devastating. The following days were an education in the terrifying elegance of Alistair Finch's power. There were no raised voices, no public declarations of war. The demolition of Chad Thorne and Tiffany LaSalle was conducted from the serene, book-lined fortress of Alistair's study, a room that smelled of aging leather and quiet authority. Eleanor sat in a wingback chair by the marble fireplace, pretending to read, but in reality she was watching a master at his craft. It began with a single 20-minute phone call to the chairman of Mr. Sato's Japanese conglomerate. Alistair spoke in flawless, formal Japanese, his tone one of deep, personal regret. He didn't threaten or demand. He simply expressed his profound disappointment that a firm of their reputation would consider associating with a man of Thorne's demonstrably fraudulent character. He painted a picture not of a failed business deal, but of a catastrophic lapse in judgment that could tarnish a century-old reputation. He spoke of honor, integrity, and the sacred trust between partners. By the time he hung up, Eleanor knew that Chad Thorne's access to Asian capital was gone forever. The deal was not just dead, its memory was now a source of corporate shame. The next phase was more subtle. He didn't leak a story to the press. Instead, he made a quiet call to a revered old guard analyst at a top-tier investment bank, a man Alistair had mentored decades ago. He mentioned as an aside that he'd been looking at InnovateX's numbers and had found certain ambitious projections that reminded him of the dot-com bubble. He also mentioned, with a tone of amused pity, the comical story of a tech CEO and a counterfeit Patek Philippe. He knew that was all it would take. He hadn't planted a bomb. He had simply drawn a map for people who were paid to find them. The market, with its animal instincts, smelled blood long before a single story was published. The whispers started in the exclusive chat rooms and forums where billion-dollar decisions were made. Finch is pulling out. There's something rotten at InnovateX. Pre-market trading became a bloodbath. When the opening bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange, the company's stock didn't just fall, it cliff-dived. Chad Thorne's life didn't end. It was methodically unwritten. The articles that came out were brutal, not just about the financials, but about the culture of fakery he had cultivated. The watch became a viral meme, a perfect symbol of his entire hollow enterprise. His board of directors, facing shareholder lawsuits and a public relations nightmare, convened an emergency meeting and ousted him in a unanimous vote. The man who had graced magazine covers as the future of tech was now a pariah, a punchline in the story of his own hubris. Tiffany's fall was less complex but no less complete. The cell phone videos of her assault went viral, stripped of the restaurant's gilded context and laid bare for the world to judge. She was not a powerful socialite asserting dominance. She was a common bully, vicious and pathetic. Her father, a man whose real estate empire depended on relationships with banks that Alistair Finch indirectly controlled, issued a public statement disavowing her actions and cutting her off financially. The invitation stopped. The friends vanished. The gilded cage she had lived in dissolved, leaving her exposed and alone in a world that no longer had any use for her. She disappeared from the city, her name becoming a cautionary tale whispered at charity galas. Eleanor felt no triumph. She had wanted justice, and she had achieved it herself in that moment she named the flaws in Chad's watch, asserting the power of knowledge over the power of wealth. This was something else entirely. This was an eradication. It left her with a profound and unsettling sense of displacement, as if she were a character in a story being written by someone else. A week after the incident, as the last tremors of the earthquake he had caused began to subside, Alistair found her in the small, sun-drenched conservatory she had claimed as her temporary workshop. The delicate, disassembled components of a vintage Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso were laid out on a black velvet cloth, a constellation of brass and steel. She was hunched over the balance wheel, her loops screwed into her eye socket, her breathing slow and even, her hands moving with a surgeon's impossible steadiness. He watched her from the doorway for a long time. This woman who could create a perfect, ordered world on the head of a pin. He saw the absolute focus, the deep and abiding peace she found in the act of mending what was broken. This was her power. It was quiet, constructive, and in its own way, just as absolute as his own. This was the woman he loved. "It's done," he said, his voice soft, careful not to break her concentration too abruptly. "The board has activated the morality clause in his contract. He's left with nothing. The company is being dismantled and sold for its assets." Eleanor set down her tweezers and removed the loop. Her hazel eyes, magnified moments before, seemed impossibly clear and direct. And does that bring you satisfaction, Alistair? He walked into the room, the scent of rain from the garden clinging to his clothes. He looked down at the intricate disarray on her workbench. It brings me a sense of equilibrium, he corrected. A system that had fallen out of balance has been righted. An error has been corrected. He will not be in a position to harm anyone that way again. You are not a system, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You are a man I love. And what you did was not impersonal, it was biblical. He finally met her gaze, and in that moment, the formidable titan of industry receded, leaving behind the man she knew. The man who had lost his first wife to an illness he was powerless to stop, who had retreated from a world he could not control, and who had sworn to never feel that helpless again. When I saw you, he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw whisper, standing there with your uniform torn, with her cheap victory smirk. It wasn't just fabric, Ellie. It was a tear in the very structure of my world, the one I've been trying to rebuild. A world where the people I love are safe. My reaction, it was not just about him. It was about my own failure to protect you from ever having to endure that in the first place. I will never allow that feeling to take root again. Not ever. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. He wasn't a king defending his queen. He was a man terrified of his own ghosts. She stood and stepped towards him, closing the small distance between them. She didn't embrace him. Instead, she reached up and gently placed her palm against his cheek. His skin was cool. My love, she said, her voice resonating with a quiet strength that filled the small room. The world is a messy, imperfect mechanism. It will always have flaws. You cannot protect me by burning down every part of it that you deem unworthy. You protect me by simply being in it with me. Your strength isn't in what you can destroy. It is here, with me, in what we can build. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as a long, slow breath escaped him. It was the sound of a tension held for a week, for a decade, finally being released. It's a lesson, he admitted, that I find difficult to learn. He opened his eyes and looked at the watch parts on her desk and then back at her. So, Eleanor Vance, tell me, what is it we are going to build? A fire ignited in her eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated purpose. I have spent years observing a world I wasn't a part of, saving money earned in places I despised. It's over. I am going to open my own workshop, not a shop, a proper atelier, a place dedicated to the preservation of craft and the celebration of authenticity, a place that is the absolute antithesis of the gilded liar. 2 weeks later, on a crisp, sunlit Saturday, he took her to a narrow cobblestone street she had always loved, a historic lane lined with bespoke tailors, artisan bookbinders, and family-owned galleries. He stopped before a corner storefront, a jewel box of a building made of old Boston brick with large multi-pane windows and a heavy door painted a deep, dignified forest green. A discreet, hand-painted sign in the window simply read, "Available." Eleanor stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It was the place, the one she had carried in her mind's eye for years, a dream so vivid she could almost smell the polishing compound and hear the chorus of ticking clocks. Alistair, it's perfect, she whispered, her heart aching with the beauty of it. But the cost in this location, it's a fortune. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a single, heavy, ornate brass key. He didn't hand it to her. He held it out on his open palm. I didn't lease it, and I didn't buy it for you, he said, his voice imbued with a careful sincerity. I acquired the building as a foundational asset. Consider me the silent investor in your new venture. This is not a gift. It is a partnership, a joint investment in a business I believe in, run by a master whose skill I respect above all others. You, Eleanor Vance, are the heart of this enterprise. You are the mainspring, the balance wheel, the escapement. I am merely providing the case, a safe, beautiful housing to protect the brilliant mechanism within. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes as she looked from the key to his face. He understood. He truly understood. This wasn't charity or a grand romantic gesture designed to possess her. It was a profound act of respect, an acknowledgement of her as an equal, a master in her own right. She closed her hand around the key, its cold, solid weight a promise in her palm, and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the collar of his coat. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered back, his arms encircling her, holding her tight. "You are reassembling me, Ellie, one tiny piece at a time." Months later, Vance Horology opened its doors. The interior was a masterpiece of quiet elegance. Reclaimed wood, soft lighting, glass cases displaying a few perfect vintage timepieces, and at the heart of it all, Eleanor's workbench, visible to all who entered. It was a space that was both a workshop and a sanctuary, a temple to the tangible. Collectors and enthusiasts came not just to have their precious heirloom serviced, but to watch her work, to speak with a woman who understood that what she was really mending was not metal, but time itself, the captured moments and memories that each piece held within its ticking heart. One late afternoon, as golden light slanted through the large front window, Alistair entered quietly, carrying 2 porcelain cups of tea. He placed one beside her on the workbench, where she was finishing the final assembly of the reverso. He sat in the worn leather armchair in the corner, a chair that was now permanently his, and watched her. She was not a queen, and he was not a king. Those were roles for a world of performance and illusion. Here, in this quiet space filled with the gentle polyrhythm of ticking clocks, they were something more real. He was a man who had learned that true strength was not the power to obliterate, but the courage to build. And she was a master of her craft, the center of her own universe. A woman who had faced down the ugliest parts of the world, not by becoming like them, but by remaining steadfastly, brilliantly, and precisely herself. The ripped uniform had been a catalyst, a moment of violent clarity that had forced them both out of the shadows. He had dismantled the past, and she, with her steady hands and unwavering heart, was building their future, one perfect, satisfying click at a time.